Good day, everyone. I will talk about how people affect the environment, the things we do every day, like farming, building houses, using cars, and making products change nature. These changes also affect our health, our food, our water, and even the weather. That's why it's important to understand how human action connect to the environment. For the internet learning out loud, at the end of this session, learners should be able to identify and explain major environmental problems affecting local and global ecosystem, analyze the impact of human modification such as urbanization, agriculture, and industrialization on natural system, evaluate the short and long-term consequences of environmental degradation on biodiversity, human health, and climate, propose sustainable action or policy recommendation to mitigate environmental issue, and promote ecological balance and reflect on their own behaviors and choices that contribute to the environmental change and identify opportunities for improvement. By the end of our lesson, you should be able to know the main environmental problems that affect us today, understand how human activities like farming, urbanization, and industry change nature, and see the short and long term effects of these problems on people, animals, and the climate. You should be able to suggest simple and sustainable action or policies to help protect the environment, and lastly, reflect on your own habits and choices to see how you can improve and help care for nature. And this is our presenter. For our first presenter is Mr. Advincula John Vincent. Next is Mr. De Vera Marl Nico Marie. And next is Solis Jabez John. For our library discussion, let me introduce Mr. De Vera for it to explain.
Good day, everyone. Today we're going to discuss about our library. So for our topic is divided into four parts. First, we have introduction, defining the scope of human income. In this part, we aim to define and understand what is human impact and what constitutes human impact. Second, we have the drivers, our root causes of environmental degradation. In this second part, we try to dive deep on what are the possible causes that are affecting the environment. And then third part, we have the effects, consequences of environmental stressors. On this third part, we aim to link the causes that we have found to what are the effects on the larger world. And lastly, we have the mitigation solutions and the path to sustainability. Now that we are aware of the problems and how it affects the world, the question is, what's next? What should we do next? So those are the questions that the last part aims to answer. And then as you can see, our very last part are the references. So if you're interested in knowing where we got the information, ayan. So there's the references. So let us begin on the first part. Let's bring the floor back to Mr. Solis.
Thank you, Mr. De Vera. For our first part, introduction defining the scope of human impact. Environmental issues define. Environmental issues are challenges that threaten nature or diminish the capacity of natural systems to sustain life. Example of environmental issues include pollution of air and water, soil degradation, deforestation, extinction or endangerment of wildlife, and climate change. Environmental issues are often the result of human action in the areas of industry, agriculture, transportation, and waste management. Environmental issues are important because they affect the food we grow, the air we breathe, the water we drink. Communities rely on for stability. Our topic is how human activities affect the environment. Everything we do, like cutting trees, building roads, and using machines or throwing waste, has an effect Some effects are small and local, while others are big and global, like climate change. This impact can harm the balance of the environment. For example, we pollute the air, it affects our health and the weather. When we waste water, it lessens the supply for people and animals. When forests are destroyed, many species lose their homes. Our next part, anthropogenic impact. Anthropogenic impact means the effect or changes in the environmental that are caused by human activity. The word anthropogenic comes from anthropos, human, and genesis, origin. So it literally means human made. This impact can be direct, like deforestation, pollution, or building cities, or indirect, like greenhouse gas emissions that alter climate system. In environmental science, anthropogenic impact are concentrated with natural process, volcanoes, earthquake, natural climate cycle. The key idea is that humans are now dominant geological force, so much so that scientists even debate naming our current era the Anthropocene, defined by measurable human fingerprints on Earth's system, climate, atmosphere, ocean, and biodiversity. Example of anthropogenic impacts are air pollution from vehicle and factories, water contamination from untreated sewage or industrial waste, soil degradation from pesticides, landfills, and mining, global warming from greenhouse gas emission, biodiversity loss from habitat destruction, and overexploitation. Our topic is about how human impact means the effect of people on the environment. It can be direct, like cutting trees or throwing garbage into rivers. It can also be indirect, like buying products that need too many resources to make. This impact can be small, like one community polluting a river, or very big, like climate change affecting the whole world. To solve problems, we must first know what human action caused the damage and how serious the effects are. And for our next topic, Mr. De Vera will present it to us.
Thank you so much for discussing the first part, Mr. Solis. Now let us proceed to the second part, the drivers, root causes of environmental degradation. So for the second part, we have several topics, but the main topics that we're going to discuss first is pollution. Yeah, we're going to branch out to the different types of pollution. Next, we have RDO or depletion and overexploitation. So we will discuss what are the current human practices that are prevalent today that contribute to the overexploitation, consequently to the depletion of our resources. And lastly, we will discuss on the second part the human population pressure, how population comes into the equation when it comes to discussing environmental problems. So let us begin with pollution, particularly our first type of pollution, air pollution. So air pollution. Air pollution happens when gases, solid particles, or reactive chemicals are released into the atmosphere at levels that interfere with normal environmental balance. These pollutants can harm ecosystems, damage human health, or disrupt climate processes. Many pollutants are chemically active, meaning they can change into other substances once in the air. For example, nitrogen dioxide or NO2 can react under sunlight to form ozone O3, which is harmful at ground level. So when we talk about air pollution, the usually we think of smokes from the vehicles, smoke belching, burning of tires and such. But when we talk about air pollution, it's more broad than that. It doesn't only involve gases, but also solid particles or reactive chemicals. And I think one aspect that is also part of this definition is that many pollutants are chemically active. So meaning there is a possibility that the chemicals that are involved in air pollution can transform in the air as well. So that's a thing that we should also watch out for. So let us proceed. Next, let's discuss the major pollutants, their sources, and chemistry. So first, we have sulfur oxides. We have first mainly sulfur dioxide and sometimes sulfur trioxide. So you might be asking, where can we find these sulfur oxides and how do they contribute to air pollution? So we can find them from burning coal, oil, or diesel that contain sulfur, industrial smelters, and factories. So as we have seen, they can be found from burning coal, oil, and diesel. So these are actually the things that we use to get energy from to power our vehicles and such. So what's the technicalities behind this sulfur dioxide? So sulfur dioxide can oxidize into sulfur trioxide, which then reacts with water in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid. So sulfur dioxide transforms into sulfur trioxide, and when you mix it with water, it transforms into sulfuric acid. So this process causes acid rain, which damages buildings, soils, and water bodies. Sulfur dioxide itself irritates in the respiratory system. Sulfate aerosols formed in the air can also scatter sunlight, cooling the climate but reducing visibility. So the sulfur oxides have several rippling effects. First, they cause acid rain, which damages the building, soils, and water bodies. Second, the sulfur dioxide itself is an irritant to the respiratory system. And then sulfate aerosols in the air can scatter sunlight, which, granted, they cool the climate, but the trade-off is they reduce the visibility. So that's all for sulfur oxides. Let us proceed to the next major pollutant. Our next major pollutant is nitrogen oxide, mostly nitrogen oxide, but also sometimes nitrogen dioxide. So, nitrogen oxides can be found in high temperature combustion in vehicles, power plants, and industrial facilities. They can also be found in agriculture and burning of biomass. So, nitric oxide quickly converts to nitrogen dioxide. In sunlight, nitrogen dioxide can break apart and react with volatile organic compounds. Ayan, so or we also call them VOCs, producing high ground level ozone. So nitrogen oxides also form with nitric acid, another cause of acid rain. Health impacts include lung irritation, while environmental effects include ozone pollution and excess nitrogen in ecosystems, which can lead to eutrophication, which is the overgrowth of algae and plants in water systems. So nitrogen oxides, they're not that different when it comes to the sulfur oxides. They also contribute to the formation of acid rain. They can also be an irritant to the respiratory system. They can also cause lung irritation. And when we have excess nitrogen in the ecosystem, that can also lead to eutrophication, which is the overgrowth of algae and plants in the water system. So that's nitrogen oxide. Next, let's proceed. Next, we have particulate matter. So particulate matter 2.5 and particulate matter 10. So particulate matter can be found from, they are directly released from burning fuels, industrial activity, dust, and also form secondarily when gases like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide react with ammonia in the air. So you might be, when you first hear about this topic, the numbers your attention might be grabbed by the numbers. So why do we have 2.5 and 10? So the differentiation is important because particulate matter 2.5, so 2.5 stands for 2.5 micrometers. So that's very, very small. So their smallness, because of their smallness, they can bypass the body's defenses and can reach deep into the lungs. Uh, there's also even a possibility of them entering our bloodstream. So the larger particulate matter 10 micrometers can lodge in the upper respiratory system. So this particulate matter, they can cause respiratory and cardiovascular disease. They can also reduce visibility, and they can settle on leaves and impairing plant growth. So particulate matter are particularly dangerous because of its effects to the human health and to the environment. So that's particulate matter. Next, we have ozone at the ground level. So the source of ozone, unlike the previous pollutants that we have discussed, they are not directly emitted. Instead, it forms when nitrogen oxide and VOCs react under a sunlight in a chain of photochemical reactions. So ozone is a result of various reactions. So ozone is a strong oxidizing agent that irritates lungs, damages plant tissue, and accelerates the breakdown of materials like rubber and plastics. So that is ozone. Yes. So we have discussed the major pollutants that can be found in the air. So collectively, here are their consequences. So for human health, we should watch out for asthma, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or also known as COPD, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, and premature death. So for ecosystems, these pollutants can cause acid rain, which lowers the pH in soils, lakes, rivers, and it can also mobilize toxic metals. The deposition of nitrogen fosters eutrophication, as mentioned earlier, which is nutrient overload in soils and water. And ozone can damage crops, which can ultimately result to the declination of forests. So when it comes to the longer effects to climate or the ripple effects or secondary effects, aerosol particles can reflect or absorb sunlight, so which can result into cooling or warming of the weather. They can also decrease or degrade the visibility, so we would have haze, fog, and they can also interact with clouds. And so let us proceed. I think that's all for air pollution. Next, let us discuss another type of pollution that can be found in the water. Water pollution. Water pollution occurs when harmful substances, whether chemical, biological, or physical, are introduced into lakes, rivers, oceans, or groundwater at levels that damage ecosystems or make the water unsafe for human use. This can affect drinking water, irrigation systems, fisheries, and recreational areas. Excuse me. Pollutants in water do not always remain in their original form. They can persist for long periods, transform transform into new compounds or bioaccumulate, meaning they build up in organisms that magnify through the food chain. So we are surrounded by water. That's why water pollution is particularly dangerous. So water pollution can come in the form of chemical, biological, or physical. And since we depend a lot of water, as can be seen, we drink water. We use water in our irrigation systems when it comes to farming and agriculture. There's an entire industry such as fisheries that are completely dependent on water, and we also have recreational areas that involve water. So every aspect of our life involves water. That's why water pollution is particularly dangerous. And as we have also discussed in air pollution, where the pollutants can transform. That can also be found in water pollution, where the pollutants don't always remain in their original form. They can transform into new compounds, and they can actually remain dormant for long periods. Or another way is to bioaccumulate, meaning they build up in organisms and their effects are ripple through using the food chain. So let's proceed. So when it comes to tackling water pollution, it's important to distinguish between point source pollution and non-point source pollution. So you might be asking, what's point source and what's non-point source? So point source pollution comes from a single identifiable source. Examples include wastewater released from a sewage treatment plant, effluent from a factory pipe, or discharge from an industrial facility. Because the source is clear, point source pollution is usually easier to monitor and regulate. So that's point source pollution. Next, we have non-point source pollution. When this type of source pollution has no single origin. Instead, it comes from widespread diffuse activities. Examples include runoff from farm fields carrying fertilizers and pesticides, stormwater from cities that washes oil, heavy metals, and litter into waterways, or pollutants deposited from the atmosphere. Non-point sources are difficult to trace and control, making them a major challenge for water management. So, in the previous groups, we discussed different cycles, biogeochemical cycles, and one of them is the water cycle. And so, through the understanding of water cycle, we that's the reason why we have non-point source pollution. And why does the differentiation matter? Because when it comes to point source pollution, it's easier to formulate solutions. Since we already definitively know what's causing the pollution because it is a point source pollution, we can solve that easily. We can provide solutions. Unlike when it comes to non-point source pollution, it's the ripple effects that it's the small things that snowball and becomes a problem. For example, stormwater. Stormwater are not inherently corroding our soil and such, but when stormwater come to the cities and they wash the oil from our vehicles and it happens over time, then it eventually becomes a problem. So there we go. I think that's the importance between understanding the point source pollution and non-point source pollution. So let us proceed. So when discussing water pollution, let us identify the key pollutant types and their effects. First pollutant type is the nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. So they can be found in fertilizers, untreated sewage, and animal waste. So when there's too much nutrients in our water, they can overstimulate plant and algae growth as that can lead to eutrophication, as we have mentioned before, also in air pollution. So algal blooms eventually die and decompose, consuming oxygen in the water. This oxygen depletion can cause massive fish kills and loss of biodiversity. Excuse me. So, as we can see in the third peak, that is eutrophication. That's in the third peak. That's the algal bloom. So, when there's too much algae in the water and algae consumes oxygen, it leaves the other species such as the fishes less oxygen to work with, and that can cause massive fish kills and loss of biodiversity. So that is for nutrients. Let's proceed. Another pollutant type is the pathogens or the disease-causing microbes. So pathogens can be found from untreated sewage, agricultural runoff containing animal waste. So we have the bacteria, the virus, and the amoeba. So pathogens such as such as bacteriophagous and protozoa can spread like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, posing major risks to communities that rely on contaminated water sources. So I think when you talk about water pollution, this is the type of pollution we're most familiar with because pathogens have a reputation of spreading diseases, and I think that we should be wary of that. So that's all for pathogens. Next water pollutant is the heavy metals such as lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, or chromium. So these heavy metals can be found in industrial discharges, mining operations, corroded pipes, and lead-containing materials. So, for example, when it comes to factories, especially factories making vehicles or making our phones, so our phones contain chromium. They, they also contain other types of heavy metals. So when those factories discharge their waste, of course, usually to the waterways, of course, naturally, it would pollute those waterways, and which could result into various domino effects to the environment surrounding it. And next, another source of we have mentioned is mining operations. So of course, when we mine, uh, we're going to discuss mining. We have a dedicated lesson for mining, but in mining, essentially, it provides great value to society, but also it gives heavy risk to the environment. So how do heavy metals affect the environment? Heavy metals can attach to sediments and enter aquatic food chains because they bioaccumulate. Top predators, including humans, which fish, may suffer health problems such as neurological damage, kidney failure, or developmental disorders. So, heavy metals seep into the sediments, and the fishers have a tendency to eat that, and through the process of food chain, those heavy metals can be passed on to humans. And when the heavy metals eventually reach us, we may suffer from neurological damage, kidney failure, or developmental disorders. So that's for heavy metals. Next type of pollutant, we have the organic and chemical pollutants. So the examples are persistent organic pollutants or POPs, volatile organic compounds or VOCs, as I've mentioned in air pollution, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, and endocrine disruptors. So the sources are household waste, hospitals, industrial processes, and proper landfill disposal. So of course, when it comes to hospital waste, it's very dangerous and it's a problem especially among two poverty-stricken areas where this waste usually end up to. And when the people are exposed to organic and chemical pollutants, they are hard to break down. They are hard to break down chemically, naturally, and they have a tendency to travel long distances and disrupt the hormonal systems of both wildlife and humans. So the things that we use in our homes, for example, probably our shampoo or skincare or the things that we apply in our daily life that eventually end up of landfills and cause diseases to places that are new. So that's for organic and chemical pollutants. Next pollutant, we have sediment and turbidity. So the sources are soil erosion from deforestation, agriculture, and construction activities. So the sediment clouds the water, blocking sunlight needed by aquatic plants. It can also smother spawning grounds and clog the gills of fish, reducing habitat quality. So yeah, sediment from the soil can can go into the water, which clouds the water, and the fishes need the sunlight to live, and which can result to massive fish kills, and it reduces the quality of the rocks. So that's sediment and turbidity. Next, next we have the thermal pollution. So they can be found from power plants and industries that discharge heated water into rivers or lakes. So when they discharge heated water into rivers or lakes, it reduces oxygen solubility and stresses aquatic life, making fish and other organisms more vulnerable to disease and less able to produce. That's thermal pollution. So we mentioned the several key pollutants in water pollution. So collectively, they have wide ranging consequences. Human activities ranging from farming and industry to energy production and urban living are the major drivers of water pollution. Once pollutants enter waterways, they can spread far beyond the original source, creating chain reactions in ecosystems and posing long-term risks to public health. The results can be seen in events such as toxic algal blooms, contaminated fish supplies, loss of drinking water, and widespread biodiversity decline. So, the human activities, one way or another, cause pollution to the water. And as I've mentioned at the start of discussing this like particular type of pollution, water is everywhere. Water is an omnipresent element in human life. And once we polluted our water, we are become more vulnerable to its effects. We can get diseases, we can have developmental issues in the food that we eat, such as fishes. They can also be contaminated. Water, we drink it. So we need clean drinking water. And uh, for these particular reasons, I think water pollution must be addressed comprehensively because it has several sources, whether they are point sources or non-point sources. So that's all for water pollution. Next, let us proceed to another type of pollution. We have land and soil pollution. Land and soil pollution. So soil is more than just dirt. It's a living resource that supports agriculture, regulates water, recycles nutrients, and sustains ecosystems. Soil pollution occurs when harmful chemical, physical, or biological substances build up in the soil at levels that disrupt its natural functions. Excuse me. This pollution can damage soil structure, reduce fertility, kill beneficial organisms, and even make crops unsafe to eat. So when we think of soil, we think it's just dirt. But every life depends on soil. So when soil pollution occurs, whether that's in the form of chemical, physical, or biological, uh, it can reduce the soil structure, reduce fertility, and kill beneficial organisms. That's why land and soil are very important. Next, let us discuss the major sources of soil pollution. First, we have the industrial accidents and spills. Oil spills, leaking underground storage tanks, ruptured pipelines, and chemical plant accidents can release toxins directly into the soil. These contaminants often spread further into the surrounding land and water systems. So, oil spills, those kind of accidents that are happened when uh, transporting goods, um, the oil and the chemicals that they carry, they can seep into the soil and cause ripple effects to the environment. Next, we have agricultural chemicals. Intensive use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides leaves residues that may remain in the soil for years. Some chemicals leach down into groundwater while others accumulate in the upper soil layers, affecting soil microbes and plants. So the pesticides that we use in our plants, not only it may affect the plant itself, but also the soil surrounding it. So that's the first two major sources of soil pollution: industrial accidents and spills, and agricultural chemicals. Next, we have improper waste disposal, landfills, and e-waste. Uh, Waste that is not properly managed releases pollutants into the ground. Landfills produce leachate, a liquid mixture carrying organic compounds, heavy metals, and solvents that seeps into the soil and groundwater. Electronic waste is especially hazardous as it contains lead, mercury, cadmium, and brominated flame retardants and PCBs. So with the advent of technology and technology becoming more accessible to people, one unintended consequences is the rise in e-waste. So actually, fun fact, if I'm not mistaken, the Onyx Street in Manila, so that's basically near our school. The community in those streets are popular for sa mga mamabaklas. So or that's the Filipino term mamabaklas, but I think in English they're called e-waste scrapper. I, I might be mistaken, but the community there is suffering from various respiratory diseases because of recycling e-waste. Basically, they extract the variable materials in those in laptops or computers such as copper, and the process of taking that out, burning parts of the technology can harm people, especially pregnant women. So that's an issue, and the improper disposal of e-waste is an issue that is happening right now, not far from us. Next, we have the atmospheric deposition. Factories, power plants, cars, and even open burning release particles and gases like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, lead, and other heavy metals. These pollutants can travel long distances in the atmosphere before gravity, rain, and snow pulls them back into the ground. So this is also what's happening that we see every day. The waste coming from factories and cars, the various pollutants, they rise into the atmosphere and then eventually fall to the ground. So not only did they cause air pollution, they also cause soil pollution. So let us proceed to the next. Next, we have mining and mine tailings. Mining leaves behind waste rock and tailings that often generate acid mine drainage, which lowers soil pH and creates highly acidic conditions. This acidity dissolves heavy metals like arsenic, lead, and cadmium, allowing them to spread into nearby soils, rivers, and groundwater. The pollution can linger for decades, contaminating food, water, and ecosystems long after mining stops. So, as I've mentioned before, there is a special chapter regarding mining, but I think what uh, we should take from this description is the pollution can linger for decades. Uh, why mining is such a dangerous activity for the environment is it's because of its permanence. Once it has been damaged, it cannot be undone. So that's for mining. Let's proceed to soil salinization and sodification. Salinization happens when excess irrigation water evaporates and leaves behind dissolved salts, which gradually accumulates in the soil. In sodification, Salts dominate, breaking down soil structure and reducing its ability to hold water and air. Both processes weaken plant growth, lower crop yields, and can eventually render farmland unproductive. So that is soil salinization and acidification. Let us proceed. So how do these various uh, processes in soil pollution harm? First, it disrupts nutrients. Pollutants can bind to soil particles, blocking essential nutrients from being available to plants. Second, it damages the soil structure. Some chemicals break down soil aggregates, leading to compaction, poor drainage, and limited root growth. Third, when it involves the food chain transfer, contaminants can be taken up by crops and passed into animals and humans through food. To best illustrate this, the previous group discussed about the food chain and the food web. So when the soil in which the producer is planted into is contaminated, the contamination comes from the producer itself, which transfers to the herbivore, the carnivore, and eventually reaches the apex predator. Next, we have leaching. Chemicals may move downward through the soil into groundwater, contaminating drinking supplies. And lastly, toxicity to soil life. Worms, fungi, bacteria, and insects are key players in nutrient cycling, and they are highly sensitive to pollutants, and their decline weakens soil health. So those are the mechanisms of harm. Let us proceed. So that's all for land and soil pollution. Now let us discuss the next type of pollution that is usually overlooked or not many people pay attention to. But regardless, they harm us. We have noise and light pollution. Noise and light pollution. So, common source of noise pollution is the road and air traffic, industrial machinery, construction activities in cities, and even large public events like concerts or sporting matches. So noise pollution, prolonged exposure to noise pollution can damage our hearing, increase our stress, disrupt our sleep, and can contribute to cardiovascular diseases such as high blood pressure and heart problems. Even constant low-level noise in cities has been linked to reduced concentration, fatigue, and higher community stress. So noise pollution, uh, ironically, it's called noise pollution, but it's a silent pollution that not a lot of people pay attention to, but they do affect us in more subtle ways. Next. So noise pollution also affects our wildlife. It interferes with how animals communicate and interact with their environment. So, for example, we have bats who use echolocation to navigate their spaces because they're actually blind. So, noise pollution interferes with that. Next, birds living near busy roads may change the pitch or timing of their songs so they can be heard over traffic noise. So even birds adapt to the noise at the busy roads. Nocturnal animals often avoid noisy areas, shift their foraging times, or reproduce less successfully. So nocturnal animals, we usually talk about owls. In marine environments, loud ship engines can disrupt whale and dolphin communication, affecting navigation, feeding, and mating. Noise pollution, in short, reshapes how species behave, where they live, and how well they survive. So that is noise pollution. Next, we have light pollution. So light pollution is around us, especially us in the city. So street lights, illuminated billboards, sports stadiums, vehicle headlights, and office buildings lead Next type of pollution we have is light pollution. So light pollution can be found in street lights, illuminated billboards, sports stadiums, vehicle headlights, and office buildings lit through the night are all major contributors of light pollution. So light pollution affects humans. Exposure to artificial light at night disrupts the natural circadian rhythm, the body's internal clock that regulates sleep and biological cycles. This can lead to sleeping disorders and may even affect long-term health by suppressing melatonin, a hormone linked to immune function and cancer protection. So that's light pollution. Not only it affects humans, it also affects our wildlife. Artificial light alters natural behaviors in both animals and plants. So migratory birds can become disoriented, colliding with lit up buildings or veering off course. Insects are drawn to artificial lights, reducing pollination and food availability for other species. Sea turtle hatchlings often crawl inland towards city lights instead of heading for the ocean, lowering survival rates. And nocturnal predators lose the natural contrast of the night sky, also called sky glow, which disrupts hunting and predator prey dynamics. Plants can also be affected since flowering and other seasonal changes are often triggered by natural light cycles. So, excuse. Next. Oh, wait lang. Pakat na lang to sa pagitan ng video. Pero, naka-on cam ba kayo parehas?
Ano?
Naka-on cam ba kayo parehas? Tuloy-tuloy? Okay.
Ako kumuha ko tubig.
Kasi may na-internet. Okay. Sige. Okay. Kasi, ano sa akin kasi, naka-off tong parehas ko. Mahina internet ko, so baka pero yun. Ayan. Okay, so ituloy na ulit. So you might be asking, why do noise and light pollution matter? So noise and light pollution may not leave behind toxic sludge or chemical clouds, but their impacts ripple through human health and ecosystems. They alter behaviors, disrupt natural cycles, and put additional stress on already fragile habitats. As urban areas expand, reducing unnecessary noise and controlling artificial lighting becomes essential steps in protecting both people and wildlife. So that is noise and light pollution. After discussing the various types of pollution, let us now proceed to different ways in which human activities overexploit and eventually deplete the natural resources, beginning with deforestation. What is deforestation? Deforestation is not just about chopping down trees. It refers to the large-scale permanent removal of forests to make way for other land uses, such as agriculture, cattle ranching, palm oil and soil plantations, mining, and infrastructure projects. Unlike sustainable forestry, which allows for regrowth and management, deforestation strips land of tree cover without recovery in mind. So deforestation is the large-scale permanent removal of forests to make way for other land uses. Next. So where do deforestation often occurs? So the Amazon basin in South America and the tropical forests of Southeast Asia are among the hardest hit regions. The forces behind deforestation are tied to global markets and consumption patterns. So, for example, we in beef production, the vast areas of forests in Brazil are cleared to create grazing pastures for palm oil plantations. In Indonesia and Malaysia, palm oil is used in processed foods, cosmetics, and biofuels, making it one of the most profitable yet destructive crops. Next, in soil cultivation, much of the Amazon's cleared land is converted to soy farms, mainly to feed livestock rather than humans directly. So, the Amazon in South America and Southeast Asia are the hotspots when it comes to deforestation. And the reason why deforestation often happens is because of the increasing demand to products that are required and increased consumption among the population as well. Next. So when it comes to timber, logging, both legal and illegal, provides valuable hardwoods for construction and furniture. So as I've mentioned before, many of these industries are driven by international demand, meaning consumers worldwide play an indirect role in forest loss. Next. So what are the consequences of global deforestation? So the impact actually goes beyond losing trees. First, biodiversity loss. Forests are home to more than half of the world's terrestrial species. Clearing them drives species extinction at alarming rates. Second effect is soil erosion. Without tree roots to hold soil in place, land becomes prone to erosion, reducing fertility and clogging rivers with silt. Third is carbon emissions. Forests as carbon sinks, absorbing carbon dioxide. Their destruction releases the stored carbon, fueling climate change. Fourth is rainfall disruption. Forests help regulate rainfall through evapotranspiration. Deforestation can alter weather patterns, contributing to droughts in some regions and floods in others. Next. So, looking at the case of the Philippines once had dense forest cover, but by the end of 20th century, more than half of it was gone. The country's deforestation has been driven by both legal and illegal logging, often with government concessions given to companies that exploited forests for short-term economic gain. So the problems include weak enforcement, corruption, and poverty in upland land areas, further fueled forest destruction. Next. So, of course, deforestation in the Philippines has several damning consequences. First is flash floods and landslides. Tree loss leaves slopes unstable and rivers prone to overflow. The prominent example is the Ormoc flood of 1991, which killed thousands, was linked to deforestation in the watershed above the city. Next effect is the biodiversity decline. The Philippines is a global biodiversity hotspot, yet deforestation has placed many endemic species found nowhere else on Earth at risk of extinction. For example, our Philippine eagle, it's at risk of extinction. Third effect is climate vulnerability. With fewer forests to absorb rainfall and buffer storms, communities face greater risks from typhoons, droughts, and changing climate conditions. So we are become more vulnerable to changes in climate. Next. Deforestation is both a global and local crisis. On one hand, international markets drive large-scale forest loss in the Amazon and Southeast Asia. On the other, countries like the Philippines face the compounded effects of unsustainable logging and weak governance. The result is a dangerous mix of ecological collapse, economic hardship, and social vulnerability. So deforestation, it's a problem everywhere, and in the Philippines, it's mostly caused by weak governance and concessions given by the government to the companies that perform these activities. So that's the first type of resource depletion and overexploitation. Let us proceed to the next, which is overfishing. Yeah. Resource depletion and overexploitation, fishing. So as I've mentioned before, water is everywhere. As a matter of fact, oceans cover about 70% of the planet. And for much of human history, they seem inexhaustible. But modern industrialization has pushed marine resources far beyond their natural limits. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, more than one-third of global fish stocks are now overexploited, meaning fish are being caught faster than they can reproduce. Many others are fished at their maximum sustainable limits, leaving little room for recovery. So, for much of human history, it seemed like the water and the resources contained in the water are never ending. But with the modernization in our lifestyle, in our ways, the industrialization of production, it push marine resources far beyond their natural limits. Next. So, how industrial fishing pushes limits? The growth of industrial fishing fleets after World War II radically changed how humans interact with the oceans. Advanced technologies such as radar, sonar, refrigeration, and massive trawlers allow fleets to pursue fish across entire oceans. As a result, once abundant species like cod in North Atlantic collapsed, and tuna, sharks, and groupers now face severe pressure worldwide. So, those are the effects of industrial fishing. Next. So there are different types of destructive fishing practices. So not all fishing is equal. Some method cause enormous collateral damage to ecosystem. First type of destructive fishing is blast fishing. The use of dynamite to kill fish en masse destroys coral reefs which serve as nurseries for countless marine species. The practice provides quick catches but leaves long-lasting scars on reef ecosystem. Another type of destructive fishing is cyanide fishing used to capture live fish for the aquarium and restaurant trade. Cyanide stuns fish but poisons corals and other reef organisms. The reef structure often dies even if the targeted fish survive. Another destructive fishing practice is bycatch. Large-scale nets, especially drifting gill nets and long lines, unintentionally capture turtles, dolphins, seabirds, and other non-target fish species. This bycatch waste can exceed the weight of the intended catch. Next. So another type of overfishing is whaling. For centuries, whales were hunted for oil, meat, and baleen. So baleen is used in corsets and other products. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, commercial whaling nearly drove several species, including the blue whale and humpback whale, to extinction. International pressure eventually led to the International Whaling Commission moratorium on commercial whaling in 1986. In the prelims, we discussed about the tragedy of the commons. And I think that that concept, the tragedy of the commons, is particularly, especially applicable to overfishing. Fisheries illustrate a classic economic dilemma, the tragedy of the commons. International waters are open access, meaning no single nation owns them. Each fishing fleet seeks to maximize its own short-term gains, leading to collective overexploitation. Without effective regulation, the common collapses, leaving everyone worse off. Examples of this collapse include the 1992 shutdown of the Canadian cod fishery, once the world's richest, which put tens of thousands of people out of work. Similar risks exist today for tuna, anchovy, and other keystone fish populations. Next. So what are the consequences of overfishing and whaling? First, ecosystem imbalance. Removing top predators like sharks or large fish destabilizes food webs, leading to trophic cascades where the entire ecosystem shifts. Second is food security threats. Billions of people rely on fish as their primary protein source. Overfishing undermines this critical food supply. Third is economic losses. Fishing communities face declining catches and uncertain livelihoods. Fourth is cultural impacts. Whales and many fish species hold cultural, spiritual, and symbolic importance for coastal communities worldwide. So the consequences of overfishing and whaling are wide-ranging. Next. Overfishing and whaling show how quickly human exploitation can overwhelm natural resilience. The oceans may be vast, but without careful stewardship, the risks become empty seas. A sobering reminder that abundance is not the same as infinity. That's all for overfishing. Let us discuss another form of resource overexploitation and depletion, which is mining. So another method is mining. Mining is essential to modern life, from the copper in wires to the nickel in electric car batteries. Minerals power economies and technologies, but beneath this necessity lies a brutal truth. Mining often leaves behind landscapes that are scarred, polluted, and dangerous for decades, or maybe even centuries. Next. So the lifestyle incomes of mining. The environmental damage from mining doesn't come from one stage but across its entire life cycle. First, we have the exploration and extraction. Prospecting and drilling often cut into forests and ancestral lands. Open pit mines flatten hillsides and wipe out habitats, leaving ecosystems fragmented or destroyed. Next. Another effect of mining in its lifestyle is the waste rock and tailings. For every ton of valuable metal, many tons of useless rock are dug up. This overburden and mine tailings are slurry-like leftovers from ore processing, contain toxic elements such as arsenic, mercury, and cadmium. Poorly managed dams can leak or collapse catastrophically. Another effect is acid mine drainage or AMD. When sulfide-rich rocks are exposed to oxygen and water, they form sulfuric acid. This acid dissolves heavy metals, which then flow into the rivers and groundwater. AMD can continue for centuries, making streams uninhabitable for fish and unsafe for communities. One prominent example of the extremes of the effects of mining is the Marcopper disaster in Marinduque. The most infamous case of mining's negative impact is when a drainage tunnel at copper mine in Marinduque ruptured, releasing 1.6 million cubic meters of toxic tailings into the Buak River. The spill suffocated aquatic life, contaminated farmland, and displaced entire communities. Nearly 30 years later, residents still deal with the health risks and ecological damage of the Marcopper disaster. So this was a big news back then in 1996 and still holds relevance even to this day. Next. So even remediation, it has its own set of challenges. Fixing the damage from mining is enormously difficult and expensive. So for example, let's talk time frame. Acid mine drainage can last hundreds of years. Some of the abandoned mines in the US and Europe still leak pollution centuries after closure. So acid mine drainage, its effects can last for hundreds of years. So it doesn't disappear overnight. Another challenge that is facing we are facing is the cost. Rehabilitating a single large mine site can cost billions of pesos, far more than what companies or local governments often set aside. In many cases, when mining companies pull out, communities are left with the toxic legacy. So the cost of rehabilitating mines are just too much. And no entity, whether that is a government or companies, have that kind of money or is willing to set aside that amount of money to rehabilitate those places in which they conduct mining, especially as we know how companies operate. Their main goal is profit. It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. Why would companies set aside large amounts of money to rehabilitate, to conduct an activity such as rehabilitation of the places that they conduct their mining without return? So it's it's the sad reality that we face, especially those people who live near the mining sites. Another challenge is the lack of enforcement. Weak monitoring, corruption, and underfunded environmental agencies in the Philippines mean many mines are abandoned without proper closure plans. I think, according to the news, the latest site that they're planning to conduct mining is the Sierra Madre. And we know that the Sierra Madre is very useful in keeping us safe from typhoons. So, if I'm not mistaken, it refers to the Kaliwa Dam. So there is that. Next. The consequences of poorly managed mining are several. First, human health. Heavy metals contaminate water supplies, causing chronic illnesses and developmental problems in children. Next, it also affects agriculture. Polluted soils reduce crop yields, undermining local food security. Another is climate vulnerability. Street landscapes worsen flooding, landslides, and drought impacts, making communities less resilient to climate change. Another consequence is cultural loss. Mining often displaces indigenous peoples, erasing sacred lands and traditional livelihoods. So those are some effects of poorly managed mining. Mining's biggest problem is permanent. As I've mentioned before, the problem of mining really is permanence. While forests can regrow and fisheries can sometimes recover, mine waste and acid drainage often linger for lifetimes. Without strict regulation, real rehabilitation, and stronger community safeguards, mining shifts from being a source of prosperity to a source of generational harm. And that concludes our discussion for mining. Another way in which we overexploit our resources is water depletion. Fresh water makes up about 2.5% of all the water on Earth, and most of it is locked away in glaciers or underground. That means the amount of accessible fresh water, rivers, lakes, and aquifers is extremely limited. Yet human demand keeps rising, driven by population growth, agriculture, industry, and urbanization. Water depletion happens when we consume or divert fresh water faster than natural cycles can replenish it. Let's talk about groundwater overdrafting. Groundwater aquifers are like underground savings accounts, storing water that took centuries to accumulate. When we overdraft them, so overdraft is a concept, uh, especially in banking, where this is this is such a weird tangent, but okay. Overdraft is a concept in banking where, for example, you have a checking account and y- uh, there you have money there, for example, 500,000 pesos, and then you wrote a check for 750,000 pesos. The check that the amount in the check that you wrote it exceeds the amount in your checking account that you actually only have. That's called overdraft. So that's also the concept that is applied here when it comes to water depletion. Pumping more water out than rain and rivers can recharge, we begin running a deficit. So falling water tables, wells that once stopped shallow groundwater run dry, forcing communities to drill deeper at higher cost. Lands with subsidence as aquifers are emptied, the ground above can sink, cracking roads, damaging buildings, and permanently reducing the aquifer's storage capacity. Saltwater intrusion in coastal areas, overdrafting creates a vacuum that pulls seawater inland, contaminating once fresh groundwater supplies. So that's groundwater overdrafting. Next. The Aral Sea disaster. One of the most infamous examples of sustainable water use is the Aral Sea, located between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Once the world's fourth largest inland lake, it supported thriving fisheries and local communities. In the late 1960s, Soviet irrigation schemes diverted the rivers that fed it to grow cotton in the desert. The result was catastrophic. First, the Aral Sea lost 90% of its volume. The fisheries collapsed, wiping out local economies. It exposed lakebed sediments turned into toxic dust storms, spreading pesticides and salts across the region. Public health plummeted with rising rates of respiratory illness, cancers, and birth defects. So the RLC is fourth largest inland lake, and in just a matter of years, it actually dried up. Actually dried up, and this was when Soviet Union still exists. So due to the Cold War, I guess. Next, the Philippines, despite it being surrounded by water, faces its own water security challenges. In Metro Manila and nearby provinces, there is heavy pumping to meet the needs of over 13 million people that have significantly lowered water tables. In coastal areas like Parañaque, Las Piñas, and Cavite, seawater is seeping into aquifers, making groundwater too salty to drink. And while wealthier households can afford bottled water or purification systems, poor communities often rely on shallow wells or expensive water vendors, leaving them more vulnerable to shortages and contamination. Next. So what are the consequences of water depletion? First, irrigation accounts for about 70% of global freshwater use. When aquifers decline, food production becomes less secure. Another consequence is deeper wells require more pumping, which consumes more electricity or fuel. Another consequence is competition over scarce water can heighten tensions between urban and rural users or between industries and communities. Another consequence is rivers, lakes, and wetlands dry up, endangering aquatic species and reducing natural flood control. Next. Water depletion is often invisible. It happens underground or over decades, so people only notice when wells run dry or rivers shrink. But by then, the damage is hard to reverse. Sustainable management, rainwater harvesting, recycling wastewater, strict regulation of wells, and protecting watersheds is critical to avoid turning today's shortages into tomorrow's full-blown crisis. I think it's not included here in the website, but I think it's also worth mentioning. I think the usage of artificial intelligence, one consequence of that is water depletion as well, because the servers that are used to run this artificial intelligence services need water to cool, or it requires water. So with the usage of artificial intelligence basically booming in the recent years, consequently, it uses vast amounts of water. So that's all for water depletion. And we have discussed the types first pollution, and another the resource depletion and over exploitation. Next, let us discuss the last topic on my part, which is the human population pressure. Human population pressure. So why does population matter? Population growth acts as a multiplier for every environmental problem. More people means more demand for food, water, and energy, and more waste and pollution. Even if technology gets cleaner, the sheer numbers of push Earth's systems closer to their limits. So the population that we have mentioned before exists, and pollution rather that we have mentioned before exists, and when you put population in the equation, it serves as a multiplier. It makes basically everything worse. So, for example, when there's more people, there's more demand for food, for fish. So, the issue of overfishing increases. There's more demand for technology. So, the mining increases and such. So, population, unfortunately, acts as a multiplier for every environmental problem. Next. So let's talk about the concept of carrying capacity. This is also a concept discussed in the prelim. So carrying capacity is the largest population size that the environment can sustain indefinitely without degrading. It depends on available resources like food, water, energy, and how efficiently they are used. So overshoot happens when we exceed carrying capacity. Resources are consumed faster than they can regenerate, leading to ecological collapse. So, for example, let's have an analogy here. Overgrazing in grasslands is a classic example. If too many cows feed in one area, grass cannot regrow, soil erodes, and eventually the land turns barren. Apply this to humans. When too many of us rely on the same freshwater, farmland, or forest, the system breaks down. So that is the concept of carrying capacity. Let's proceed. Next, let's talk about ecological footprint. So, ecological footprint is defined as as the measurement of how much land and water area is required to provide everything a person consumes, from food, housing, energy, goods, and to absorb the waste they generate. So, what's the global status of ecological footprint? According to the Global Footprint Network, humanity currently uses the equivalent of 1.7 Earths each year. This means it takes almost 2 years for Earth to regenerate the resources we use in just one. Next. So another angle that is interesting to talk about is not all footprints are equal. A child born in the US may have a footprint of 10 times larger than a child born in sub-Saharan Africa. Wealthier countries consume far more resources per person, from heavy diets to energy-intensive lifestyles. We have the Earth Overshoot Day. Each year, researchers calculate the date when humanity has used up the planet's annual budget for renewable resources. In 2023, the overshoot fell on August 2, meaning we lived on ecological debt for the rest of the year. So, the concept of Earth Overshoot Day is interesting. Basically, it takes into consideration the overall resources that Earth has, and then our usage of those resources. And so in 2023, we used up all of Earth's resources by August 2, meaning for the rest of the year, we are running on ecological debt. Basically, may utang tayo sa kalikasan. Next, another concept that we talk about is overpopulation versus overconsumption. Overpopulation in developing countries like fast-growing populations such as Manila, Lagos, or Dhaka face overcrowding, strained public services, food insecurity, and pollution. So, of course, that's we are overpopulating here in the Philippines. Next, we have the concept of overconsumption, where wealthy countries with smaller populations consume massively more resources. For example, the richest 10% of people globally contribute almost half of all carbon emissions. So the reality is both forces, overpopulation and consumption, interact. Overpopulation increases pressure on basic needs like food and water, while overconsumption in wealthy nations accelerates climate change and ecological collapse. Without addressing both, sustainability is impossible. Next. How population growth intensifies global problems. So population growth makes everything problem worse, from food demand. More mouths to feed means more farmland, leading to deforestation, fertilizer runoff, and soil degradation. Industrial agriculture already consumes 70% of global freshwater use. Aquifers and rivers are being drained faster than rainfall can replenish them, especially in dry regions and megacities. And more people mean higher energy demand if fossil fuels remain the main source, emissions and climate change accelerate. So population growth makes existing problems worse. Next. So billions of people generate mountains of solid waste, sewage, plastics, and air pollutants. Cities struggle to manage this overflow. So also expanding populations push cities forward outward, replacing farmland and forests with concrete. This fragments habitats and reduces food security. Next. So that's all for human population pressure, and that wraps up the discussion regarding the second part of our discussion, the drivers, root causes of environmental degradation. For the third part, I yield the floor to Mr. Advincula.
Thank you for that, Mr. De Vera. As for my part, I'm going to discuss the consequences of environmental stressors. Environmental stressors are natural or human-induced factors that disrupt the balance of ecosystems and directly affect human life. From global warming to biodiversity loss and human health impacts, these stressors are interconnected and affect everyone. Whether you live in a city like Manila or in coastal areas vulnerable to rising seas. Let's proceed. Let's start with climate change and global warming. Human activity has disrupted the Earth's human climate system primarily through the emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These gases absorb infrared radiation due to their molecular structures, re-emitting it within the atmosphere and thereby trapping heat. This process is known as the enhanced greenhouse effect. While the natural greenhouse effect maintains Earth at a habitable temperature, the anthropogenic enhancement has shifted the energy balance, resulting in progressive global warming. We can think of it as the greenhouse gases as the blanket that keeps the earth warm enough for life. Normally, it is a good thing. But human activities like burning coal, oil, and gas, or clearing forests have made this blanket thicker, trapping extra heat and warming the planet faster than the nature intended. Now, let's proceed. The consequences are extensive and interconnected. Rising global temperatures increase atmospheric water vapor, which intensifies precipitation, events, and floods. Thermal expansion of seawater and accelerated ice melt drive sea level rise, exposing coastal areas and island nations to inundation. Elevated sea surface temperatures provide more latent heat to tropical cyclones, enabling rapid intensification and extreme rainfall, as seen in Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. Warmer and drier conditions also lengthen wildlife seasons and exacerbate drought severity. So, hotter air holds more moisture, which can trigger heavier rainfall and floods. In the Philippines, Typhoon Yolanda in 2013 showed this in action. It strengthened extremely fast because the surrounding seas were warmer, resulting in catastrophic damage in Tacloban. Wildlife was affected too. Mangroves and coastal bird species lost their habitats, and fish populations were disrupted by storm surges. Humans were displaced, infrastructures destroyed, and the local economies crashed. Thermal expansion and ice melt raised sea levels, threatening low-lying areas in Bulacan. Some areas are slowly sinking, creating the so-called sunken city. This floods homes, kills crops, and forces communities to relocate. Forests and grasslands dry out during heat waves, increasing wildlife risk. Globally, wildfires in California destroy thousands of acres of wildlife habitat, release massive amounts of CO2, and threaten human settlements. Now, let's proceed. Vulnerability to climate change is unevenly distributed. Developing countries and small island states are disproportionately affected due to geographic exposure, limited adaptive capacity, and socio-economic constraints. The combination of rising seas, stronger storms, and insufficient infrastructure make these regions particularly climate vulnerable. Not everyone experiences climate change equally. The Philippines, for example, being a developing country with many coastal communities, faces stronger typhoons, floods, and droughts. Humans face displacement, loss of livelihood, health risk, and economic strain. Wildlife loses habitats, food sources, and faces higher extinction risk. Small island states experience similar issues, with coral reefs dying off and marine biodiversity declining. And that concludes our discussion on climate change and global warming. Now, let's proceed to the other environmental stressor, which is the loss of biodiversity and economic services. Biodiversity encompasses genetic, species, and economic diversity. Its erosion is not only a biological concern but a fundamental threat to human survival since it underpins ecosystem services that provide food, water, climate regulation, and cultural value. So, biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. From genes to entire ecosystems, humans depend on it on for essential services like food, water, purification, pollination, and climate regulation. Losing biodiversity weakens these systems, threatening our survival. Let's proceed. Global biodiversity is in a steep decline. The Worldwide Fund for Nature in 2024 reports an average of 73% decrease in monitored vertebrate populations between 1970 and 2020. Habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation, and climate change remain the principal drivers. The loss of wetlands undermines natural purification, leading to higher treatment costs and greater exposure to contaminants. Deforestation destabilizes local climates, raising temperatures and disrupting rainfall patterns. Declining pollinator populations place agricultural productivity and food security at risk. The Food and Agriculture Organization in 2018 estimates that pollinators contribute hundreds of billions of US dollars annually to crop yields. So, globally, the Amazon rainforest and coral reefs are shrinking, which reduces animal habitats and destabilizes the climate. Locally, illegal logging in Palawan destroys forests that serve as homes for endemic species like the Palawan pangolin and the Philippine eagle. Wetlands like Manila Bay filter pollutants naturally, but as these are degraded, humans face higher water treatment costs and risk of contamination. Farmers lose pollinators like bees, which are critical for crops such as mangoes, coconuts, and corn, affecting food availability and livelihoods. The loss of biodiversity also weakens ecosystems, making them less resilient to natural disasters. For example, destroyed mangroves in eastern Visayas worsen the impact of Typhoon Haiyan, reducing natural storm protection for human and wildlife alike. And that concludes our discussion on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Next, let's discuss direct human health impacts. Environmental stressors directly affect public health. Fine particulate matter PM2.5, which penetrates deep into lungs, causing oxidative stress and systemic inflammation that contribute to respiratory diseases, cardiovascular conditions, strokes, and premature mortality. The World Health Organization 2021 attributes millions of deaths annually to air pollution. So, tiny particles, this PM2.5, in polluted air can enter the lungs and bloodstream, causing asthma, heart disease, strokes, and even early death. Metro Manila suffers from this due to heavy traffic, waste burning, and industrial emissions. Let's proceed. Lead contamination, often from soil, water, and deteriorating infrastructure, crosses the blood brain barrier in children, leading to irreversible neurological damage, cognitive decline, and behavioral impairments. Inadequate sanitation and unsafe water exposure expose populations to waterborne pathogens, such as cholera, dysentery, and other diarrheal diseases, which remain a leading cause of preventable death in developing countries. So, children in areas with old lead-based paints or contaminated soil risk them to permanent brain damage. Unsafe water sources in Leyte after Typhoon Yolanda led to cholera outbreaks, killing or hospitalizing many. Beyond humans, polluted water and soil also harm aquatic life. Fish die-offs in Manila Bay, for example, from chemical runoff and sewage contamination shows how environmental stress directly damages wildlife and disrupts the food chain. And that concludes our discussion on direct human health impacts. Let's proceed with the last environmental stressor, which is the ozone layer destruction. The stratospheric ozone layer shields light from harmful ultraviolet radiation or UV rays. In the late 20th century, scientists identified that chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs and related ozone depleting substances were catalytically destroying ozone molecules. Ultraviolet radiation breaks down CFCs, releasing chlorine atoms that repeatedly react with ozone, causing large scale depletion. So, the ozone layer acts like the Earth's sunscreen, and without it, harmful UV rays can penetrate the atmosphere that can cause skin cancer, eye damage, and harming plants and animals. Coral reefs, for example. are very sensitive to UV exposure, which slows down their growth and damages marine biodiversity. Now let's proceed. In response, the Montreal Protocol was adopted in 1987 as a legally binding international treaty mandating the phase out of CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. Nearly 99% of controlled ozone depleting substances have since been eliminated. Monitoring indicates that the ozone layer is slowly recovering, and full recovery is projected within the 21st century. This case represents a landmark success in international environmental governance and demonstrates the capacity of global cooperation to address planetary crises. So, now, thanks to our global cooperation, because we are slowly fixing the ozone layer. This is one of the few environmental success stories that proves that humans can reverse damage when nations work together. Benefits as well. The reduced UV radiation protects amphibians, fishes, and forests from harmful effects, indirectly safeguarding food security and ecosystem stability for humans. And that concludes our discussion on ozone layer destruction. In summary, environmental stressors from climate change and biodiversity loss to pollution and ozone depletion impact our wildlife, ecosystems, and also us humans. So, Typhoon Yolanda showed us how stronger storms affect people and nature. Manila Bay demonstrated the consequences of habitat and water degradation. And sunken areas in Bulacan reminds us that rising seas also has real consequences. Understanding these effects is crucial for creating solutions, which we'll explore in the next part of this presentation. The next topic will be discussed by Mr. Solis, which is mitigation, solutions, and the path to sustainability.
For mitigation solution and the path of sustainability, for our first topic is the overarching strategies. To fight climate change, we must use a multi-phase approach coming from the top. Laws and regulation can effectively limit pollution, defend habitats, and set the benchmark for energy and waste management. But we also need economic instruments that nudge us towards cleaner and greener living, such as pollution taxes, subsidies for clean energy, and backing for sustainable farming. Educational initiatives and public awareness to go hand in hand with these incentives so we can learn to cut waste, select low carbon transportation, and give a leg up to conservation. Partnership between government, companies, scientists, and local communities are what really get the ball rolling. Comprehensive plans, funds, ensure accountability are need to turn ideas into action. Um, Now let's talk about solution. We need different ways to protect the environment. First, the government should make rules and laws to stop pollution and protect forests. Second, we can use tax and rewards to push businesses and people to choose clean energy and reduce waste. Third, education is important to people need to know how their action affect nature so they can make better choices. And last, everyone should work together, government, businesses, school, and communities, because we can only make real change if we help each other. And now for the next topic is Mr. John Vincent Advicola will present it to us.
Thank you for that, Mr. Solis. Let's now move on to reducing the carbon footprint. The concept of carbon footprint quantifies greenhouse gas emissions attributable to individuals, organizations, and nations, usually expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents. Calculation methods include activity-based accounting, where emissions are derived from direct measurements such as fuel use or electricity consumption, and broader input-output methods, which estimate emissions embodied in economic activity. In simpler terms, a carbon footprint measures how much greenhouse gas we produce, whether as individuals, companies, or even countries. It's like adding up all the carbon our activities release into the atmosphere. For example, driving a car, using electricity, or eating beef all contribute to your personal carbon footprint. Countries calculate these numbers to understand how much their economy and lifestyle impact global warming. Let's proceed. Effective reduction strategies vary in impact. Transitioning to electric vehicles significantly reduces life cycle emissions where electricity grids are decarbonized. Home insulation and energy efficiency improvements provide immediate, cost effective reductions in heating and cooling demands. Dietary shifts toward plant based foods substantially lower per capita emissions since livestock, particularly ruminants, contribute disproportionately to methane emissions. So, for examples, the electric vehicles. No? Switching from gas powered cars to EVs reduces emissions from fuel. This works best in countries or cities where electricity is generated from renewable resources like wind or solar. For example, in Denmark, EVs are powered largely by wind energy. So driving an EV there has a much smaller footprint than in places relying on coal. Another example is energy efficiency at home. Simple improvements like adding insulation, using energy efficient lighting, or sealing windows can cut electricity usage and reduce carbon emissions immediately. Even in Metro Manila, upgrading air conditioners or using LED bulbs can save energy and reduce household carbon footprints. And last example is the dietary shift. Eating more plant-based foods and less meat can reduce methane emissions. Livestock, especially cows, produce methane, a greenhouse gas, much stronger than CO2. So, choosing vegetables, beans, or plant-based alternatives, even a few times a week, can make a difference. In the Philippines, promoting plant-based meals in school canteens or office cafeteria is a practical example. Let's proceed. Carbon offsetting remains controversial. High quality projects must demonstrate additionality, permanence, and verifiability. Many offset markets, however, have been criticized for overstating climate benefits or failing to ensure long term carbon storage. No? Uh, Carbon offsetting is when you try to cancel out emissions by funding projects that absorb carbon, like tree planting. But not all projects are reliable. Some trees die or carbon storage is just for short term. For instance, a company might claim to offset its emissions by planting trees in Mindoro. But if the forest is cleared a few years later, the benefit then disappears. So offsets must be carefully verified to actually help the climate. Policy frameworks such as carbon taxes, emissions, trading systems, subsidies for renewable energy, and public transport investments play a crucial role in incentivizing and sustaining reductions at scale. Uh, Policies are essential to make carbon reductions meaningful at a larger scale. So, carbon taxes make polluting activities more expensive, encouraging people and companies to reduce emissions. For example, Sweden, they has a carbon tax that pushes industries to switch to cleaner energy. Another example is the emissions trading systems, which allows companies to buy or sell allowances for greenhouse gas emissions, rewarding efficiency. Another one is subsidized for renewable energy, help people to afford solar panels or wind energy, reducing reliance on fossil fuels. In the Philippines, programs that support rooftop solar installations help households to cut electricity emissions. And last one is the public transport investments that reduces car use, expanding MRT lines or bus rapid transit systems in Manila to reduce traffic emissions and improve air quality. So, in summary, Reducing the carbon footprint is a combination of individual actions, lifestyle changes, and governmental policies. Whether it's driving an electric vehicle, eating less meat, improving energy efficiency at home, or supporting renewable energy, every action counts. Reliable carbon offsets and strong policies amplify these efforts, making large scale sustainability possible. And that concludes our discussion on reducing the carbon footprint. The next topic will be discussed by Mr. Solis.
So, for the next topic, waste management innovations. Improve waste management, conserve resource, and lower pollution. Modern strategies include composting to convert organic waste into soil nutrients, upgrading recycling system to recover more materials, and cutting waste at its source. Less packaging and more repairable products. Additionally, extended producers responsibility programs that force manufacturers to cover the end of life costs of their product and waste to energy technologies that safely turn non-recyclable waste into electricity are examples of innovations. These innovations are put into practice through community initiatives like nearby compost hubs, hazardous waste collection, hazardous waste collection locations, and unambiguous recycling instructions. For the explanation, one big solution is improving how we manage waste. We should make less waste from the start, like using less plastic packaging. We should also recycle more and compost food waste to make fertilizer for plants. There are also new ways like turning non-recyclable trash into electricity. Companies should be responsible for the waste from their products, even after people throw them away, and communities can join cleanup drives, recycling programs, and composting projects to help reduce waste. And for the next topic, Mr. De Vera will present us to us.
Thank you for that, Mr. Solis. Let us discuss the next way in which we can move in the right direction onto the path of sustainability. We have biodiversity conservation. So why should we protect biodiversity? Biodiversity is a total variety of life, from species, ecosystems, and genetic diversity that together form the living fabric of our planet. Its loss is not just about losing killed animals, but also weakening the very systems we depend on. So biodiversity is the total variety of life, and so it encompasses wide-ranging from species, ecosystems to genetic diversity. Every piece of that, every part of that are important to form the living fabric of our planet. So that's why protecting our biodiversity is very important. Let's proceed. So there are also variety of reasons and why in which we depend on biodiversity. First is through food security. Three-quarters of global food crops rely on pollinators like bees, butterflies, and bats. Without them, our yields would collapse. We also depend on biodiversity for medicine. Around 25% of modern medicine came from rainforest plants. The rosy periwinkle of Madagascar gave us treatments for childhood leukemia. So the rosy periwinkle is the picture of the flower that you can see to the right. Its extracts is what gave us the treatment for childhood leukemia. We also depend on ecosystem services. Wetlands purify the water, forests regulate the rainfall, mangroves protect coasts from storms, and it's also about resilience. Diverse ecosystems bounce back better from shocks like droughts, diseases, or invasive pests. Next. One way that we can preserve biodiversity is to control alien species. So invasive alien species, plants, animals, or microbes introduced outside their native range are the second leading cause of biodiversity loss worldwide. They often outcompete natives, spread disease, and alter ecosystems. The global economic cost exceeds 423 billion US dollars annually. Next. So, in controlling alien species, rather, there are different methods and examples. First, we have the biological control. Saving the farmland. In invasive prickly bear cactus, Blastis moth was in 20s, and its larvae is also the larvae rather of the Cactoblastis moth is also the picture below that. The risk of biological control, however, is it has a tendency to backfire. In the Caribbean, the mongoose was introduced to control rats in sugarcane fields but ended up preying on native birds and reptiles. So when controlling alien species, it can be for the benefit or it can also backfire. So we must choose our course of action wisely. Next, after biological control, we have chemical or herbicide control. So chemical and herbicide control are fast and effective, but they are herbicides used against water hyacinth in Lake Victoria, Africa, reduced plant cover but contaminated the water, harming fish and human health. Also, persistent chemicals can accumulate in soils and waterways, affecting species far beyond the target. So we need to have integrated approach. Today, ecologists emphasize combined methods. Excuse. Prevention, early detection, targeted biological or chemical control, plus community engagement. Next. So we also have various certification programs. First, we have the FSC or the Forest Stewardship Council. They label wood and paper from forests managed sustainably. An example of this is some Philippine community managed forests in Mindanao are FSC certified, giving locals fair trade opportunities. So we can see the wood is being labeled FSC certified. They are from well-managed certified seafood caught without destroying habitats or overfishing stocks. So for example, Alaska's salmon fishery holds fishing is possible. So we can see this in the picture where the sockeye salmon fillet is MSC certified, meaning it came from uh, uh, fishing that is sustainable. Next. There are various laws and treaties to ensure biodiversity conservation. First, we have CITES or Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. CITES regulates international trade in endangered species. Under CITES, ivory was banned, which helps stabilize some African elephant populations. Take a look within our home country now. The Philippines has the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act or RA 9147, penalizing poaching and illegal wildlife trade. We also have various protected areas. The U.S. Endangered Species Act saves species like the bald eagle and gray wolf. Although these laws and treaties are good and it's a stepping stone, there are also limitations. Laws are only as strong as their enforcement. Illegal wildlife trade in pangolins, for example, thrives despite global bans. So laws are only as strong as their enforcement. Next. Uh, let's discuss indigenous knowledge and community-led conservation. Conservation succeeds most when local communities are at the center. First, we have the Ifugao Rice Terraces here in the Philippines, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This 2,000-year-old terraces balance farming with forest protection, showing how indigenous knowledge sustains biodiversity. Next, still in our home country, the Philippines, we have the Apo Island, where fisherfolk established a no-take marine sanctuary in the 1980s. So because of this, within years, fish stocks rebounded, proving community-led conservation outperforms top-down programs. Let's go abroad. We have the Amazon Basin, where indigenous managed lands have significantly lowered deforestation rates than surrounding unprotected areas. So it's important that when it comes to providing solutions, we center the community at large and we not only depend on scientific knowledge, but also the knowledge of the people who live there as well, or the indigenous knowledge. Next. And that's all for biodiversity conservation. Now let us proceed to the last topic of our discussion, which is the role of everyone. We have discussed the definition of human impact. We have discussed pollution, its definition, its various types. We also discussed about resource overexploitation and depletion, and we also discussed about the possible solutions. Now the question is, what do we do? What do we do now? What's next? So science warned us that biodiversity collapse, excuse me, science warns us of biodiversity collapse, but change requires human will. Conservation isn't only about governments, it's also about behavior, ethics, and culture. Next. So, when formulating a solution, let's talk about the psychology of action. So, people have a tendency to copy what their peers do. If recycling or tree planting becomes a social norm, participation skyrockets. Another thing to take into consideration is incentives. Incentives really matter. Subsidies for solar panels or cheaper public transport drive faster adoption. If we make a solar panels more cheaper, more accessible, or if we encourage people to take public transport, the participation of people naturally increases. So, fear-driven messages can cause climate anxiety, leading to paralysis. Research shows that combining urgency with hope is far more effective. So the fear-mongering regarding climate issues are actually counterproductive. Instead of encouraging people to do something, it it puts them into the state of paralysis where they feel like they can't do anything. But as a matter of fact, we can do something. Next. So it's interesting to talk about various perspectives regarding environmental ethics. First, we have from Christianity, where humans are viewed as caretakers of creation. This is exemplified by Pope Francis' Laudato Si, which calls for ecological conversion. We also have the views of the indigenous people where they see humans as stewards, not masters. For example, the Maori in New Zealand regard rivers as ancestors. The Wanagoi River was legally granted personhood in 2017. If we travel to the Eastern Asia, where we will find Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism and Taoism, they emphasize balance and interconnectedness with nature. Next. So collective action, there have been instances in history where people acted collectively. First, we have the social movements, the Fridays for Future Youth climate strikes mobilized millions nationwide. There's also consumer boycotts. Companies like Nestle have been pressured to change palm oil sourcing due to campaigns exposing links to deforestation. We also have different community initiatives. The Million Trees Project in the Philippines and grassroots cleanups in Manila Bay show how local acts ripple into cultural shifts. So when it comes to formulating solutions, it's important to enforce it. We need collective action. Next. So we know about environmental science, and it is our duty to pass on the message. So the question is, how do we pass that message? So here are the communication that works. So do only narratives make people shut down? As I've mentioned before, the uh, fear-centered messages regarding climate put people into paralysis, which is counterproductive, but rather messages that highlight solutions and agency inspire action. So one example of this is Greta Thunberg with her activism because it blends raw truth with a call for courage. Next. Environmental conservation is not the job of scientists alone. It's about laws and treaties, yes, but also about indigenous knowledge, consumer choices, grassroots energy. Protecting life on Earth is a moral, cultural, and collective responsibility. Every action, no matter how small, is a thread in the global safety net we are trying to build. And with that, we conclude the discussion on the role of everyone and the discussion on Group 1's Nature in Crisis. And we also recognize the fact that we are the last reporter. And so, as we end the midterm part of our environmental science subject, it is worth remembering the lessons we have walked through together. Uh, we discussed the biogeochemical cycles, the Earth's way of keeping balance and recycling life's essential elements. We also discussed about biomes, each with its own unique climate and living systems. We also talk about food chain and the food web, learning that life is deeply connected and that no creature exists in isolation. We also reflected on biodiversity, which is not only the richness of species, but also the foundation of resilience, medicine, food, and stability for all of humanity. And finally, we arrive at this topic, which I would argue the most pressing lesson of all, nature in crisis. And learning about this makes you realize that the truth we face is sobering. The cycles we studied are being disrupted by climate change. Biomes are shrinking from deforestation and exploitation. Food chains and webs are breaking as species disappear. And biodiversity, the very variety of life that sustained us, is under severe threat. This is the reality of our time and it cannot be ignored. But crisis is not the end. It is a turning point. What we have learned is not just science on paper, it is a call to responsibility. If the earth can recycle and restore, so can we. If ecosystems can heal when given protection, then our efforts, no matter how small, are never wasted. Every choice, every action, every voice matters. So let this farewell not be the close of our lessons, but the opening of our role as caretakers. May we carry forward not only knowledge, but conviction. The conviction that hope is real, that change is possible, and that the story of nature does not end in crisis, but in renewal, if we choose to act. So with that, we wrap up this discussion. Thank you so much.